On December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers flew their first plane at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. It was comically named the Wright Flyer, and it made a 12-second long flight, traveling 36 meters or 120 feet. They were no doubt the pioneers of aviation, but by 1911, European nations and other engineers had already been designing far more efficient and numerous planes. This, however, was not the end of the Wright story. Despite the older brother Wilbur dying from typhoid, his younger brother continued to run the business. He would later join the NACA when he was appointed by President Wilson as a NACA board member in 1920. And if the NACA doesn't sound familiar to you, it's probably because it no longer exists. It now lives on as the main space organization in the United States, NASA, or the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The NACA, or National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, was formed on March 3, 1915, and signed into law by President Wilson. The NACA was created to keep up with European aeronautics and was made an agency rather than part of the military, to keep in truth with America's neutrality during World War I. So without being a part of the military, the NACA was, not surprisingly, established with a budget of $5,000 and a staff of 12 members, which adjusted to today's money is around $1,400,000.20. The military budget in 1915, adjusted for inflation, was around $300 million, for comparison. So with that absolutely abysmal budget, the early years of the NACA was more focused on studying and collaborating with universities and government agencies in the scientific pursuit of studying flight and solving practical problems with aeronautics. So for the first 5 years, the NACA was stuck on their small budget, even when the US entered World War I in 1917, only able to have Congress agree on building them the laboratory they requested back in 1915, when they were first formed. With these laboratories, at least, they would go on to develop wind tunnels useful for testing, and in 1920, Orville Wright, appointed by President Wilson himself, would join the committee as one of the board members. They even developed plans to prepare for the military a reserve program that would tackle any aviation problems just in case another war broke out, which it did, when the US got involved in World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. This got the NACA back into the spotlight as they began to increasingly work and collaborate alongside the military, creating many of the aeronautical inventions that we still use to this day. For instance, they developed a system of categorizing airfoils, which are still used today. Using wind tunnels, they discovered the usefulness of retractable landing gears, and are the ones responsible for the propeller placement we see on modern airplanes, as they found placing the propellers on the wings instead of on the nose was more efficient. They expanded their facilities and created new ones, and with the end of the Second World War, they proved to be a big contributing factor in the military advantage in aeronautics during the war. By 1945, the same year the Second World War ended, the staff working under the NACA had grown more to 3,000. And with the US and Russia getting their hands on German rockets and engineers, things would only escalate from here on. The most notable members that the US recruited were Wernher von Braun, and the Russians recruited the stud Sergei Korolev. With all things settled, both the US and Russia started their space expeditions in 1955, with their work on satellites. The Russians started off by successfully launching their first satellite, Sputnik 1, on October 4, 1957. And on November 3, 1957, for the Sputnik 2, the Russians sent the first animal in space. The best dog in the universe, Laika, who unfortunately died in space during her mission, as there was essentially no way of getting her back to Earth. Regardless, her mission helped in proving that space was capable of being subsisted in. And with her help, it allowed astronauts to venture into space with the knowledge that they would be relatively safe. By 1958, President Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, which by October 1st of the same year, NASA was fully formed, and all the facilities and staff of the NACA were assimilated into NASA. The NACA was responsible for many of the advancements made in aeronautics, and despite being esoteric in the general knowledge of the world, they will live on through NASA. February 1st, 1958, NASA launched their first satellite, Explorer 1, which transmitted data for only 3 months but stayed in orbit for 12 years. With this first successful mission by NASA, it made the space race official between the US and Russia, as they both hurried to trounce each other in space travel. On April 9, 1959, NASA unveiled the 7 astronauts selected for the Mercury Astronauts Corps. And a year later, in 1960, the first 19 cosmonauts were selected for Russia's future Vostok program. On April 12, 1961, among the 19 cosmonauts, Yuri Gagarin was chosen as the first man to fly into space in the Vostok 1, orbiting the Earth once until returning back by landing near the Russian city Saratov. The US responded with their own manned mission in space a month later, on May 5, 1961, with Alan Shepard becoming the first American in space on board the Freedom 7. 2 weeks after Alan Shepard's first mission, on May 25th, President John F. Kennedy makes a statement in front of Congress to increase the budget of NASA to outperform the Soviets. This increased NASA's budget by 89%, and a year later, on February 20th, 1962, John Glenn did what Yuri Gagarin did a year prior by orbiting the Earth in the Mercury Atlas 6. John F. Kennedy then doubles down again and makes the bold statement on September 12, 1962, that the US will make it to the moon before the end of the decade. The Soviets clapped back with the first woman in space on Vostok 6, Valentina Tereshkova, on June 16, 1963. And on March 18, 1965, the first spacewalk by cosmonaut Alexei Leonov on the Voskhod 2. NASA strikes back with their own American spacewalk with astronaut Ed White and his mission on Gemini 4 on June 3, 1965. And at this point, the Soviets were consistently winning the space race, with the US falling just short every time. However, in 1967, both the US and Soviets would suffer a terrible loss with the deaths of the first astronauts. On January 27th, during the launch pad tests of the Apollo Saturn space vehicle, Virgin Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Caffey were all killed in a flash fire when an electrical short caused by a fire, which in the high-pressure, pure oxygen environment, quickly spread and incinerated everything within the module. This event forever changed how NASA built their capsules, and ensured that, in the event of an emergency, the material within the capsules are not flammable. The Soviets, on the other hand, had lost their first cosmonaut on April 23rd with the death of Vladimir Komarov on the Soyuz 1. The death of these astronauts deeply affected both sides, but both nations continue with more resolve and hope in achieving the goal of landing the astronauts on the moon. In September 14, 1968, the Soviets had their first spacecraft, the Zond 5, fly around the moon and return. However, it wasn't manned, due to previous concerns and failures of the Zond. In the same year, on October 11th, the first official flight of the Apollo program occurred with the launch of Apollo 7. 2 months later, on December 24th, the first astronauts to ever lay eyes upon the lunar surface occurs with Apollo 8, as they fly around the moon before coming back to Earth. Lastly, however, on July 20th, 1969, the first humans landed on the moon on Apollo 11, with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon after landing the lunar module on the lunar surface. They spent 21 hours on the moon's surface, as well as sleeping. Along with the 2 astronauts down on the lunar surface, Michael Collins was busy orbiting above them in the command module. He would wait for them until the returning module would dock and reconnect with the command module, and after a lengthy 4 days, they returned back to the Earth, with the whole event being televised across the world. Everyone saw and marveled at the triumph. No matter what nationality, every person looked on with pride. As the plaque that was placed on the moon during Apollo 11 stated, "We came in peace for all mankind." Despite being in competition with the Soviets, Apollo 11 was more importantly a human endeavor. It was for all mankind. It was a project that took literally the best of humanity to accomplish. It took all manners of intellect, perseverance, ingenuity, and possibly gargantuan amounts of caffeine substances. Humanity working together to achieve something great, to achieve something that is deemed impossible, until we did it. I think it goes without saying that, however you may feel about the Soviets or the US, when people hear about the success of the Soviets and the US during the space race, it just fills us with such immense pride and joy at the sight of our fellow man making their first steps into progressing humanity. For instance, Laika. Laika was just one of many stray dogs that were selected for the mission, and despite her tragic end, Her story and her pictures will be carried on by future astronauts and descendants for centuries to come. Along with everyone else that sacrificed their lives, they will be remembered and venerated by future teachers and alike. As long as we do what people have always done and honor these people and tell their stories, they won't be forgotten for all mankind.